Welcome everybody to Chevalier's online. This is a incredibly timely and special evening for me. Two long-term friends are going to be talking about a person and a book that is of extraordinary currency and importance. Let me start with the interlocutor, Henry Weinstein. I would say Henry, who is now a law professor at UC Irvine, teaching the most important thing that lawyers can learn, which is how to develop and understand facts. All this law stuff is pretty interesting, but facts are pretty damn important. And Henry was a courthouse reporter. He's written for, of course, the Los Angeles Times for many, many years. He's widely read and written in the New York Times magazines. He's a very, very important journalist, and it is an unusual lawyer who would have to admit that he has never spoken off the record to Henry. He was a bulldog for facts, and now he's teaching it to another generation. The author tonight is another longtime friend of mine. I met Dan when I was an assistant United States attorney in the late 1970s, and I was leaking things to him in the hopes that I would get my name into the Los Angeles Times and thrill my friends and parents. And he was always careful to make sure that what he was being told was accurate. I had the good fortune to get an advance copy of Kamala's Way, which I hope you folks will be buying and reading. More on that later. It's really a good book, and it's exactly what you would expect of Dan. It is well written, it's well researched, it is in part funny. It captures in a very even-handed way the vice president-elect of the United States. Probably many of us had had some dealings with her in her political life or her legal life. And the snapshot that you get from reading Dan's book is precisely the experiences you've had. This is a woman who is empathetic, thoughtful, smart, ambitious, funny, and filled with the joy of life. And I think this book really, really captures it. It's a really terrific read. And as I said, what could be more timely than that? So I want to thank Henry and Dan for doing this. Welcome to Chevalier's, and I will turn it over to Henry for cross-examination.
Thanks, Bert. First, I'd like to say this is a double treat for me tonight. First of all, I get to have a public conversation with a longtime treasured colleague, Dan Morain. I vividly remembered when Dan first came onto my radar screen as a reporter many years ago, when he wrote a very artful story about the demise of a prominent West Side show business law firm in Los Angeles. And then, of course, I was particularly admiring of the great work that Dan did on the Robert Alton Harris execution. And then, of course, the second delight is getting to do something for Chevalier's, which for many years was my neighborhood bookstore. Now I live a bit further away, so I mostly buy books online from Chevalier's. But I just want to thank Bert and his partner, Daryl Holtertz, for keeping this wonderful enterprise alive, because as far as I'm concerned, independent bookstores are one of the cornerstones of a democratic society. And finally, before getting to the book, I feel like, particularly on this day, I would be remiss if I did not say that but for the man whose birthday we are celebrating today, we would not be having this conversation. Like President Obama before her, Kamala Harris owes a great debt to the civil rights pioneers, including Dr. King and particularly John Lewis, who recently passed. So now on to the woman who in less than 48 hours is going to become all at once the first woman vice president, the first African-American vice president, and the first South Asian vice president. Dan, the title of your book is Kamala's Way. Kamala's Way, That is a phrase you use frequently in the book in all sorts of situations. Could you give us your overview of what Kamala's Way is?
Well, you know, thanks a lot for having me, Bert and Henry. Great to see you, old good friends. You know, it's different meanings. Part of it is her path, her way from, well, really from her birth, 1964, to where she will be on Wednesday. But then it's also her method of operation, and it's different. It's you know, Henry, you and I have seen a lot of politicians come and go. Some very, very talented politicians. Jerry Brown, and was the first governor I paid any attention to. Jerry Brown won, and then of course in his redo, he's an extraordinary politician, and Kamala Harris in a very, very different way as well. She's incredibly tough. She's talented. She's smart. She's a quick study. She's incredibly charismatic. She comes into a room and lights it up. When you talk with her in a crowd, she gives, as good politicians do, direct eye-to-eye contact. You're the only person in the room, though of course you're not. She's just, you know, she's a unique individual and really a fascinating character, and now quite consequential.
Right. Okay, very good. Kamala clearly has been fortunate to have had a lot of good mentors. But as you say early on in the book, she is primarily her mother's daughter, a brilliant scientist who immigrated from India, and after a long and successful life raising two very vibrant daughters, she died of cancer. One of the things that Kamala says about her mother is that she was born with a sense of justice imprinted on her soul. How do you see that playing out with Kamala?
Well, you think of Kamala Harris's mother. This is a girl, really 19, who's already graduated from college in India. Her passion, and it was some major like home economics, right? And her passion, though, was to become a scientist, to study cancer. And so in 1959, this teenager persuaded her father that really she needed to go to UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, to study. And she got in, and she came halfway around the world, a woman who stood maybe 5 foot tall, maybe, you know, a slight bit taller, but not much. But what a gutsy woman she must have been. She died in 2009. I never met her. I know people who know her who just describe her as a force of nature, obviously brilliant. You're right, Kamala Harris truly is her mother's daughter. It's notable to me that when you read the biography on the California Attorney General's website, most attorneys general have their bios on that site. Kamala Harris's bio is there. She talks about her mother. She doesn't even mention her father. Now, her father is an incredibly accomplished man in his own right. He came to University of California at Berkeley to study economics and went on to become economics professor at Stanford, no small feat. So she is a product of incredibly high achievers, not wealthy people at all. She didn't enter politics with any kind of personal wealth, but she did have drive. And her mother and father both were active in the civil rights movement. Not, they weren't. As near as I can tell, they were not particularly prominent, but they did march. Readers will note that Henry as I was researching the piece of the book about Berkeley, gave Henry a call because Henry was there going to Bolt Hall, then called Bolt Hall, the law school at Berkeley, and wrote an amazing piece in the Daily Cal about Huey Newton. So Henry was there and helped me understand a little bit more. I lived across the bay in San Mateo at the time and was vaguely aware of such things, but I was a little bit younger. So anyway, fascinating time fascinating years that she entered the world.
Right, good. So besides the first quote of her mother's, about her mother that we referred to, there's another quote that Kamala loves to recount that you quote in her book, and that has to do with her various firsts. And that is, her mother Shyamala said, "You may be the first to do many things, but make sure you're not the last." How do you think that comment affected Kamala? And do you think she now thinks of her seriously as a role model?
Oh, absolutely. So Kamala Harris, I'll be surprised if she gives a speech on Wednesday. I'm sure she'll give a speech somewhere. She will recognize her mother. It happens in every one of her speeches. She never forgets to make some mention of her mother, and it's incredibly important. But she is a politician who looks for talent. This is not something that's in the book, but she endorses people for district attorney. She endorsed one of her underlings, Maggie Krell, who was running for district attorney in Sacramento. Maggie didn't win. It would have been an uphill battle. But she's out there looking for people who are on the rise. She's very she's very interested in Michael Tubbs, the former mayor, soon to be former mayor of Stockton. Calls him regularly. So she's always on the lookout for talented politicians. London Breed is one in San Francisco. Libby Schaaf is another in Oakland, mayors of each city, who she endorsed and helps to the extent she can.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned Maggie Krell. We could actually have an entire evening's conversation about Maggie Krell's work on child trafficking, but I think we'll have to forego that for another evening, but clearly a pioneer in fighting the trafficking of children. Absolutely,
she is.
Yeah, and now the primary lawyer in Northern California for Planned Parenthood. I want to read a passage of your book because I think it more fully illustrates or elaborates on a point that you made earlier. And this is the description, a particularly nuanced description, I think, that you give of our vice president to be. You say, "She grew up to be a tough, sharp-witted, exacting, hardworking, smart, multi-layered, and multicultural woman. Kamala Harris misses little and forgets even less. She has loyal supporters who have been part of her political organization from the start, and she has alienated people who were once as close as family. When cameras aren't on, she has exhibited empathy and acts of kindness for people who could not help her, and some people who have known her well see her as cold and calculating." So tell us a little more about what you see, Dan.
Well, I see all the above. Your customers, Bert, no doubt witnessed her grilling Jeff Sessions and Brett Kavanaugh and others, other nominees and appointees of Donald Trump, and she is really tough. You can well imagine she would be very good in a courtroom. But then, maybe you've seen her on Oprah or The View or Ellen DeGeneres, and she's incredibly charming and charismatic. So she's kind of all of the above. And it is certainly the case that there are people in her past who will say privately that you know, she can be quite calculating, and you know, and she has lost some friends along the way. That certainly is true. But she also has this incredible loyal group of loyal aides who have been with her for years and years and years. So it's kind of all of the above. It's one of the reasons why she's such a fascinating character.
So you mentioned her some of her grillings of government officials or would be government officials. For those who may have missed it or forgotten about it, why don't you just recount for us her encounter with Brett Kavanaugh?
Well, so it was. It struck me as, and you, Bert, and Henry would know this better than I would, but it struck me as kind of an old lawyer's trick. She was asking questions, and then she had sort of another question she wanted to ask as it was as she was seemingly over her questioning. And the question was, can you think of any law that affects men's bodies? And of course he couldn't, and he paused and he didn't quite understand the question, and she restated it. And of course there isn't. And this was in the context of asking him what his stand was on abortion rights. And of course he didn't answer that, but then he could think of obviously no law that affects our bodies, us guys, right? So anyway, I just thought it was a very clever question and a very pointed question, and one that clearly resonated with a large segment of the population. She's pretty good. Yeah, she got the Attorney General Jeff Sessions to say she was asking too many questions too fast. That's right, and he couldn't keep up with her. He couldn't keep up with her. Yes, that's good. So we've talked a bit about her mother's influence on her, and I want to turn to another influence on her, particularly on this particular day. As I read your book and as I read Kamala's autobiography entitled These Truths, I was particularly struck by how significant an impact her 4 years at Howard University, one of the nation's historically Black colleges, had on her. You very artfully described the beginning of Howard, which was created after the Civil War and named for a man named Oliver Howard, who was a Civil War Major General who headed the first Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned, and fought to ensure that 4 million people freed by the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War would have certain rights that they hadn't had before the Civil War: the right to marry, the right to own land, earn a living, and get an education. And I just want to read one other passage about the way she described her life at Howard and get you to reflect a bit on this. She said, on any given day, you could stand in the middle of the campus and see on your right young dancers practicing their steps, or musicians playing instruments. Look to your left, and there were briefcase-toting students strolling out of the business school, and medical students in their white coats heading back to the labs. Groups of students might be in a circle of laughter or locked in deep discussion. That was the beauty of Howard. Every signal told students that we could be anything, that we were young, gifted, and Black, and we shouldn't let anything get in the way of our success. Yeah, you know, it is such an extraordinary passage that she wrote in her autobiography, and I quote from that because, as I note in the book, it's an unauthorized biography. She did not help, nor did her family, nor did the Biden-Harris campaign. So I found quotes and where I could find them, and some of them were in her biography. But yes, Howard is a you know, it's my failing, but I didn't know much about Howard before I before I worked on this book. I should have. It should be just because it is such an important and emblematic symbol of what the hopes and aspirations were in Reconstruction. And it was, this was a university that was created because you had 4 million formerly enslaved people who needed an education. And one of its original callings was to teach people how to be teachers. It had it struggled at the beginning. It struggled certainly after Reconstruction. It struggled, but it persists and flourishes. And it is, you read the yearbook from the year that she graduated, and Shirley Chisholm spoke there, and Jesse Jackson spoke there on the first MLK birthday, first MLK day. It was an extraordinary time. She marched against apartheid. As she was marching against apartheid at Howard out in California, the effort was underway, championed by then Speaker Willie Brown and Congresswoman, then Assemblywoman, but now Congresswoman Maxine Waters, to divest from South Africa. So it was a confluence of events that I found kind of interesting. Stuff that mattered to her at Howard was playing out back here in her home state.
Right, and indeed that's where Thurgood Marshall went to law school after the University of Maryland wouldn't take him because they weren't admitting blacks at the time. Thurgood Marshall started law school. He's certainly one of their greatest alums,
and one of her heroes.
Yes.
I might add. Also, Earl Warren, of course, was one of her heroes. Jim Newton, our former colleague at the LA Times, did a fabulous book about Earl Warren. And I'm told that that's among the books she read, and I know that Earl Warren is contemporary, obviously, of Thurgood Marshall. He mattered to her as well. One of the things that I wish I had known, wish I know, I don't, is what she thought of the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings in 1991. She was a young deputy district attorney in Alameda County when that was playing out. Of course, Thomas replaced Thurgood Marshall. Not quite the same.
Not quite the same, and certainly would concur with what you said about Jim's book. It is the definitive work on Earl Warren. In one email exchange we had before this program, you said to me that you thought that Kamala's story was a uniquely California story. Could you elaborate on that?
It is. I don't think this could have happened in any other state. Her mother, I'm sure, could have, maybe gotten into Harvard or Yale or Princeton. Maybe her father would have gone to the University of Texas, but no, really, it's the only place they would have gone would have been the University of California at Berkeley, maybe UCLA, but really Berkeley at that time. She rose politically in a state that I think is more open to new things, and she her timing was right. It was I think that the California plays the part of a character in this story, in Kamala Harris's story. So much of what happened in California is going to happen in the rest of the country. So many of the issues that are important in California, gun safety, the fight against apartheid, they originate here and spread outward. She's part of that.
Right. So fascinating to me about her parents both coming from out of the country to go to Berkeley in the 60s. And I remember the first time I visited the Berkeley campus with my parents in the early 60s. And I can just remember that it was quite evident that there were a number of students from other countries. And my father said, you know, that's one good reason for you to go here, because you'll just meet a lot of people from very different backgrounds. So Dan, you've now covered her as a reporter, as an editorial writer, and you've now explored her life and work in depth. So could you talk a little bit more about what you considered her primary strengths?
Well, she's more than I, certainly more than I understood when I was writing columns and editorials about her when I worked at the Sacramento Bee. I think about her as being really a very strategic thinker. She's thinking more than one step ahead. She doesn't. She tries not to fight other people's battles. She tries to pick her battles. When she does engage in a fight, she engages to win. You know, I think she was thinking hard about running for president. Soon after she was elected to the U.S. Senate, she didn't reach the decision to run, though, until the end of 2018. Once she decided to run, she ran to win. So she doesn't, you know, she wasn't running for second place, although in this instance, second place is not a bad place to be. But you know, she's truly a fighter. She's a strategic thinker. She's determined. She's also empathetic. That's not one of the attributes I knew going in to reporting on this. I viewed her as you know, maybe not multidimensional. She is. I found numerous instances where she reached out to people in pain, people who could never have helped her in any way when the cameras weren't on. I found that endearing and humanizing and an important aspect of her life.
Well, since you're talking about empathy, why don't you share with the audience the closing story in your book, which is a rather, I thought, extraordinary example of empathy.
So she was her first press secretary was Tyrone Gale. I knew him a little bit. He was press secretary for the DCCC in campaign earlier, and then he was her Senate press secretary. He had colon cancer when he worked for Hillary Clinton. He seemed to have beaten it. A young man, I mean, he was 30-ish. But it recurred when he was working for Harris. It became apparent that he wasn't going to make it. Before he passed, though, and he died in October of 2018. He and the love of his life, Beth, married, and so they were a couple for only a few months. At any rate, he was near death. He was in New York at a hospital, and Kamala Harris got word that it was the end, that Tyrone probably wouldn't make it much longer. And so this was right in the middle of the midterms, the 2018 midterms. Pretty important time for a politician, especially a Democratic politician who wanted to make alliances and with other politicians. Anyway, she dropped what she was doing. She got on a shuttle up to New York and showed up there and held his hand. He died. At the end of the campaign, near the end of the presidential campaign, vice presidential campaign, your viewers may recall the instance where she was dancing in the rain in Florida. Peggy Noonan, Ronald Reagan's great speechwriter, wrote a column that I thought was kind of silly, where she criticized Kamala Harris for dancing, enjoying the moment. Imagine that, enjoying being a politician. Anyway, in this scene, she noticed somebody holding a sign that said "Win it for Tyrone," and that Tyrone was from Florida. Anyway, when on the anniversary of Tyrone Gale's death, she called Beth, his widow. Middle of the campaign, close to the end of the campaign, obviously became a very close campaign. She didn't have a lot of time, but she took the time to give Beth a call. I just thought it was so touching. And it's certainly, you know, anybody who's lost somebody knows that the dates of the death, or the dates of the birth date, or something, you know, anniversary dates can be really tough. And so what you know, Beth had a hard time in 2020 in October on that day, but you know, Kamala Harris's call made it a little less difficult.
Thanks for that recounting. Now, she has spent most of her professional career in the realm of the criminal law system. She perhaps, and I want you to talk about that a little bit. I just want to lead out with a couple things. Perhaps she's best known for the most courageous thing that she did was when she refused to seek the death penalty after a San Francisco police officer had been murdered while she was in the DA in San Francisco. She'd been endorsed by the police union, came under fire, and at the officer's funeral, Dianne Feinstein trashed her. I mean, I think that would be the most accurate way to describe it. She bills herself as a progressive prosecutor. That act certainly would be part of it. But while she was, you know, running recently, you know, she got some pretty significant criticism from a law professor up in the Bay Area, Lara Bazelon, about whether or not she really was progressive. So give us some assessment about Kamala Harris, the prosecutor, as a DA and as an AG.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, you and Bert are better positioned to understand the nuance. It is the case that, so she was sworn in as district attorney of San Francisco in January of 2003, 18 years ago, basically. And then in April 2003, Isaac Espinosa, an officer, was gunned down in the Bayview district of San Francisco. And it was, you know, from all accounts, Isaac Espinosa was a good cop, decent man. His anniversary was coming up. And she said before the funeral that she wasn't going to seek the death penalty. As you know, the killing a police officer is one of the crimes for which you can be sentenced to death. And she took a lot of heat for that for months afterward. She would go into the Hall of Justice, that's where the DA's office is in San Francisco, where the police headquarters is. And if she walked down the hallway and officers were there, they would turn their backs on her. So she was being shunned by the police officers in San Francisco. It was a really quite emotional, awful time. I think she probably learned something from that. You have to be a little careful about the battles you pick. I think she was, I don't think there was any way that she was going to seek the death penalty against the fellow who murdered Isaac Espinosa. She wasn't going to do that, but she probably could have figured out a way to, I don't know, politic it in certain ways. When she became Attorney General, she ran on a platform saying, yes, I oppose the death penalty, but I will enforce the law. Okay. Others had done that before her. Jerry Brown opposed the death penalty. He enforced the law. John Van de Kamp, former district attorney in LA, opposed the death penalty. He enforced the law. Stanley Mosk did. So many had opposed the death penalty, yet enforced the law. So nonetheless, there were two ballot measures when she was Attorney General to abolish the death penalty. Perhaps voted, and both failed, but not by wide margins. And perhaps voters would have benefited from her insight as to why they might want to abolish the death penalty. And on the flip side, there was one to speed up the death penalty, which of course isn't going to happen, didn't happen. Voters might have benefited from her wisdom there. There again, she didn't take that stand. Probably the most noteworthy example was when she didn't take a stand on the initiative that rolled back California's three-strike sentencing law. This is a law in the course of her campaign in 2010. She thought needed to be changed, but when it came before voters in 2012, she ducked that issue. So she could have taken stands in those. She didn't. There were other instances like that. Those are probably the four big examples where she just didn't take positions, public positions, on issues of the day. Laura Bazelon is an incredibly smart, accomplished lawyer and writer, terrific writer. She comes at the criminal justice system from the left of Harris. Harris spent a lot of time as a district attorney, deputy district attorney. She put a lot of people in prison who committed bad crimes. So I don't think you erase that. I think to this day she is less liberal than perhaps the left of the Democratic Party would wish.
Now, one other thing that there are some people that have said that she would hardly be the only person in politics who was accused of I'll call it playing to the cameras, looking for the high profile issues. Now, one of the biggest issues clearly facing the country now is climate change. And I know there was some criticism of her, at least among people that worked in the Attorney General's office. She didn't pay enough attention to the environment when she was in the office because it wasn't as high profile as things like the mortgage crisis. What do you think about that?
Well, I've paid attention to attorneys general back to Van de Kamp in the middle 1980s, and Van de Kamp was a very aggressive attorney general, innovative attorney general. Her successor, Javier Becerra, separate and apart from the 100+ times he sued Donald Trump, did some very aggressive prosecutions and failed some very aggressive civil lawsuits. Harris did some of that, but didn't do as much as some of the others who came before her or after her. So yeah, she could have done more with that office. I do believe that that's the case. She did do some really interesting things as it related to climate change. She filed lawsuits to prevent railroad from going nearby a school down in I think it's Long Beach. She was very interested in limiting air pollution around the warehouses in the Inland Empire. So there were issues. She didn't, I don't think though that she especially made her mark on the environment. She is certainly not a science denier. She certainly believes that climate change is well upon us. Fire weather in the middle of January probably is an exhibit A, but not the only one, right? I mean, we've been living this for years now in California, and she understands that.
One area in which she was more assertive is an ongoing problem of sleazy for-profit colleges ripping off poor kids. And at least as far as I can tell from your book and what else I've read, that she was very aggressive about going after this one school that did a lot of damage called Corinthian College. Now, as you know and note in the book, the administration that's about to leave office, in particular the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, was not at all helpful to students who had been, pardon my French, screwed by these sleazy operations. Do you think she's likely to get in there and push hard for student refunds, for credit reinstatement and things like that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But you know what? She's going to follow. I mean, I think that she's going to follow Joe Biden's lead. If he determines that this needs to be an issue, then it will be an issue. She will certainly be advocating for it, as will Elizabeth Warren. I mean, this was where she met Elizabeth Warren on this issue of student loans and student debt, and particularly kids or students, not kids. You know, many of them are military veterans. Many of them are in their 30s or 40s trying to better themselves. So certainly not kids, but students who are trying to get some kind of education, and they get lured into bogus for-profit colleges. President Obama had done a lot to crack down on them. The Trump administration, as it did in so many other instances, did a 180 on that. So sure, I think that this will be an issue in the Biden-Harris administration, as well it should be.
One question that came in from a member of the audience is that, can you think of one case from early in her career that you consider sort of particularly emblematic of who she is as a lawyer?
Well, the case that I write about in the greatest detail is the case that she brought as Attorney General at the end of her tenure as Attorney General against the classified website, classified ad website Backpage. She acted when no other attorney general in any state acted. When the feds didn't act, she brought a lawsuit alleging that this site was engaged basically in pimping. What offended her mostly was that many of the people being trafficked on this website were girls, minors, and so she brought really what was, I think, a landmark case. It initially got thrown out. Federal law preempted state law in this regard, according to the first judge who ruled on it. But then, after she had been elected to the Senate, but before she took office, she authorized the refiling of the case under state law, clearly state law, money laundering statutes, and that case is proceeding to trial probably this year. But that's that was a strong stand that she took, and it was based on her time in part as a deputy district attorney in Alameda County, and then a prosecutor in San Francisco, and also in the city attorney's office in San Francisco, where she dealt with victims of victims of crimes who were children, sex crimes. And so anyway, so I think that's probably the most significant case. The feds ultimately did bring a prosecution against Backpage and did ultimately shut down Backpage, and Donald Trump ultimately signed into law a change to the Communications Decency Act, the federal law that protected Backpage, that carves out a little bit of an exemption, so it makes it a little bit more difficult for websites to traffic in minors these days.
Right.
Dan, can I ask a question here?
You have the right.
I guess so, yeah. As I read the book, and it covers the arc of her life and career, I can remember when Kamala was in the short strokes of the competition to be chosen for vice president. And for bunches of questionable reasons, people were always saying, or heard many people say things like, Joe Biden better have a food taster, and she's a bundle of ambition, and she's jumped from job to job. Knowing her as you do through your study and through your personal dealings with her over the years, what do you think of that canard about her being nothing but ambition?
Well, I think it's a canard. Well, first of all, I think, yes, of course she's ambitious. You don't become, you don't go to college without ambition. You don't become district attorney without ambition. Of course she's ambitious. So what? It's to her benefit, and I hope to the country's benefit, that she is ambitious. But it's not, her success as vice president, and of course, I mean, we should all assume that she wants to run for president. She's going to run for president, but her ability to run for president, her success depends on Joe Biden's success. So she has to be the best vice president she can possibly be to President Biden. And that means giving him her best advice. It means not undermining him in public. I can't imagine she's going to do that. She's way too smart for that. And it's not something that she would want to do. I will be shocked if, I suppose I know the conventional wisdom is that Biden's going to be a one-term president. I don't exactly buy that. He's wanted to be president for a long, long time. If he can serve a second term, if his health permits, he's going to run, I think. Most presidents do. So 4 years or 8 years, whatever it is, she'll run, but her success is going to hinge on his success. She cannot undermine him. It's my 2 cents, but from out here in California.
Kelsey, some questions?
We have none in the chat so far, but I do want to remind everyone, if you'd like to unmute and ask the question yourself, you're more than welcome to. Oh, but I do see Linda just dropped a question. What do you think prompted her to be so aggressive in her criticism of Biden and the presidential debates?
Well, she runs to win. She knew that her path to victory required that she win in South Carolina. Joe Biden had a well of support in South Carolina. She was looking for a way to topple him, and so that's why she went after him in a very direct way over school desegregation, busing to achieve school desegregation. He was on the wrong side of that issue back in the day, and she challenged him on it. She challenged him because she was running to win. I think it's he got over it. He knew, he understood that it was only business. It's not personal. So I think that it's just kind of that simple. When she realized she wasn't going to win, she dropped out.
Hey, Dan, it's Tom Rosensteel.
Hey.
The view here in Washington among political people is that she was not a particularly good presidential candidate. Didn't do very well, started strong, but was really not ready for prime time. I even know people in her campaign who felt that way. Why do you think that was, and what do you think that bodes for her as vice president? Well,
you're right. I mean, I wasn't on the campaign trail, and I've been on campaign trails before, and so I felt it. I try to not write about things I don't know very much about. So I knew what I read about her presidential campaign. That said, you're right. It never took off. She never raised the money that she thought she could have raised in California. She raised $12 million in that first quarter, which was mediocre at best. Barack Obama in 2007 in his first quarter raised 27 million. So her theory of the case just didn't work. She never caught on in South Carolina. Democrats, to win the presidential nomination, to win the primaries, it goes through the South. You have to do well among in the southern states, and that means doing well among Black voters. She just never took off. Joe Biden was way stronger than she thought, and other candidates thought as well. She never found her lane, I think. She flip-flopped on the question of healthcare. I also think, though, that she was smart to get out when she got out. Had she limped along through Iowa, and then she would have been on the ballot in California, it really would have badly affected her. So she got out when she needed to get out. Lots of candidates, lots of presidents run multiple times before they get the nomination and before they win, like Joe Biden. So, and he wasn't so good the first time either. Ronald Reagan wasn't so good the first time either. So it's so hard to become president. I mean, there will only have been 46 come Wednesday. She knew going in that maybe she had a 10% chance of getting the nomination. She knew it was a long shot, and it was. It was also a long shot for Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker and even Bernie Sanders. So yeah, she did not fare well. But there will be a next time, I think, Tom.
One member of the audience asked, what role did Willie Brown play in her political career, and is he still influential with her?
Certainly Willie Brown, and this is something Tom will recall. Willie Brown was very close to Herb Cain. Tom, by the way, is a former LA Times reporter, and I had the great good fortune of working with Tom on a piece about Herb Cain many years ago. So they had a relationship. They were an item in 94 and 95. The first story I wrote about Kamala Harris was in 1994 when Willie Brown appointed her to a plum job, paid her well. They had a relationship. It was public. People knew about it. Willie Brown's wife knew about it. It was not something that he hid. It was in the columns of Herb Cain, so everybody knew it. It was a very public relationship. So it ended after Willie Brown was elected mayor. Also declared so in the column of Herb Cain. So it played out publicly at the beginning and in the middle and at the end. Willie Brown is loyal to his friends. And so although their relationship was long over, he certainly helped her politically, win that first race, opened some doors for her. But, every politician has somebody who helps them. Willie Brown never would have won in 1964, his first assembly race, had it not been for Philip Burton, the legendary, then young member of Congress from San Francisco. Burton, Nancy Pelosi holds the seat that Burton once held. So Willie was, of course, very helpful at the beginning, but then so were others. Debbie, names that people don't know. Debbie, they're in the book, but Debbie Meslow has been with Kamala Harris since long before she was elected. Andrea Steele has been with Kamala Harris since long before she was elected. Mark Buell was her first campaign finance chairman. He's really pivotal. I doubt Willie Brown has any influence today over Kamala Harris at all. And certainly by the time she ran for a district attorney in 2003, keep in mind the relationship was now over for about 8 years. She described him as an albatross and was really quite derisive of him in an interview with San Francisco Weekly. She said that her future is beginning and his is over, and she's going to be around for 40 years. And anyway, so she was quite derisive. She doesn't talk about it. She hasn't talked about it. She doesn't write about it in her autobiography. Willie does on occasion talk about it, although he did not talk to me for this book. I've talked to him many times in the past. This was one where he took a pass. So yes, he was influential. All politicians have people who helped them along the way.
After Willie Brown, for a very public person, her personal life had been quite private until several years ago. And I just want to bring up one other thing, which is in your book, you describe Kamala and her sister Maya, a public interest lawyer who's her closest advisor, as detail-oriented regarding everything. And there's a terrific anecdote in your book that I would like to make sure that we talk about even briefly before we close out tonight. And it's a story about how Kamala made what I will call a final check before she decided to marry attorney Doug Emhoff. Why don't you tell the audience about what she did?
Well, the final check, and Bert, by the way, was very helpful in helping me understand a little bit about Doug Emhoff. Doug Emhoff is a golfer. So they got married in 2014 in a ceremony at the Santa Barbara courthouse, the Hall of Administration, their lovely place. And it was a small ceremony, but before she got married, she asked Mark Buell, her original campaign finance chairman, to go golf with Doug Emhoff, because Buell had said to her at one point in their history that you tell a lot about a person by how he or she plays golf. I wouldn't know, I'm not much of a golfer. So anyway, so he took Emhoff out to some fancy country club in Sonoma County, and they played around, and obviously Emhoff passed that test because Mark Buell gave this union his blessing.
As I recall, he said something to the effect, well, he can swing a club, but basically he's a really good guy.
That's right.
So I guess that's what you learn on the golf course, and he passed that test.
Indeed.
Bert, I think I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you. So this was really a wonderful evening for me. It's an important night to get to know this person who is going to be our vice president for 4 years, or some of us hope at least 8 years, and then be the president of the United States. And so I have to thank Henry and Dan for doing this. Kelsey, can you make sure everybody knows how they can buy Dan's book online from Chevalier's, so that we can move the merchandise here for Dan, who would like to earn beyond his advance?
Of course. So there are several ways you can get a copy of this amazing book. One is to email us at chevaliersbooks@gmail.com. You can go to our site where you can order a signed copy that Dan so kindly helped us out with. Or you can go to bookshop.org, or you can now visit us at our new location at 133 North Larchmont Boulevard, which is just across the street from where we used to be. We are doing distance browsing. We would love to see you in person and hand this copy to you with gloves and sanitizer.
Thank you all for being here tonight. This was a really special evening. Thanks, Dan, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Bert. Thank you very much. And Henry, great to see you.
Great to see you. Thanks, Bert. Long live Chevaliers.
There you go.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.